So we'll have a few minutes for questions. Boy, he's great. That was really great, deep conversation. It was definitely not about Twister after all. Although I could have asked you that, actually. Ma'am.
Yeah, I want to ask you about about the Wisconsin movement. How does that fit into this?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, that sounds like the kind of movement that you would approve of.
Yeah, I approve of people from our side finally standing up and saying something and putting some force behind it. But I think it's a complicated question. Because I think, we weren't standing and defeating a candidate who ran on the idea that he was going to kill the unions.
I mean, the reality is he did wave flyers during a campaign saying, hello, end collective bargaining.
Yeah, and he won.
It wasn't a surprise.
He won, and we stayed home, right? We stayed home and didn't defeat him. So it's a democratic process. He won. We ought to say this is wrong, and here's why it's wrong, and here's why we don't need a world where workers have no protection. But we need to wage that battle peacefully and vocally, but recognize it's because we didn't show up that he's in power right now.
It's a very enlightened view that you're willing to accept that elections have consequences.
They have to. That's what democracy is about.
Well, yes, and we know it as an objective fact, but most people who don't like the resolution of an election forget the fact that if you didn't win the election, you don't get. It's the same thing with picking judges, right? I mean, people, you worked for Scalia,
right?
Even though you and Justice Scalia don't see eye to eye on many issues, most issues. The people who object to Justice Scalia being appointed forget that it was an election that decided the outcome of a presidency, which in turn, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
That's always the process.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Ma'am.
One of the comments that you made earlier was about the politician that has a ton of money and can, help get in the door. But technically, I mean, the politician still has to be supported by the party. So the party has to jump on board with that concept of.
Right, we didn't talk about parties. Parties are a whole other layer here, and parties are kind of like a make-work program or a WPA program for hacks, right? Both sides. Mm-hmm. They don't want to see an individual come out and not raise money because it hurts the party.
Exactly right. I mean, the parties will oppose this. But I think first we need to recognize, the Supreme Court has produced a world where corporations have more free speech rights than political parties. Mm-hmm. Political parties are more heavily regulated by federal election law right now than corporations are.
And you know about the change in Texas now where corporate money can suddenly come into campaigns.
So I actually think parties are an important part of our democracy. Yep. They're kind of a leavening force that kind of keeps a consistent set of principles that are supposed to be what the party's about and tries to, there's a lot of hacks in it, there's a lot of patronage that's distorting, and I don't disagree with any of that, but I think we need to support parties. I think parties are critical. So in the system I was describing for funding congressional elections, if a voter doesn't opt to give his voucher to one candidate or the other, then I think that money should be allocated to the party that voter is registered to. And it leaves a big question about what independents do, and I don't know how to solve that problem, but that's the basic structure. But I agree with you. Right now, I think the Tea Party is going to see this as the Republicans get closer to the 2012 election. The biggest reason why we have earmarks is that they are extremely efficient devices for flushing campaign money into political campaigns.
It's an indirect ask, isn't
That's right.
it?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Look at the tax system. The Wall Street Journal had a piece in December about temporary tax provisions. And they were like puzzled. They said in the 1990s there were almost no temporary tax provisions, and now there are hundreds of them. Why is that? And it's the most obvious reason in the world. When you have a temporary tax provision, as it's about to expire, lobbyists call up the people benefited by that temporary tax provision and say, we have a battle here. We have to make sure that we get the support we need to get this extension, this temporary provision extended. And of course, that requires tons of money that flow into the system. Sure. So politicians recognize this, and they architect our tax system so it can milk resources from the most powerful, richest people to get their special kind of tax benefit. And the best example of this is the very first of them. The very first of these targeted tax benefits, these temporary tax benefits, was the research and development tax credit that Ronald Reagan enacted in his first big tax bill. When they enacted it, the Democrats said, we're skeptical that this is going to work. The Republicans said, we think this is actually going to work. So that they struck a deal. They said, let's have a compromise. We'll make it temporary, And then at the end of this period, we'll ask the economists whether it worked or not. And if the economists said it works, we'll make it permanent. So that was the deal. Perfectly sensible way to deal with something nobody was sure about. At the end of that period, all the economists on the left and the right said, this is a great idea. This really worked. This absolutely produced more investment than it cost in tax revenue. We ought to make this thing permanent. They have never made it permanent. Why haven't they made it permanent? Because the people who benefit from it are the richest research companies in the country. They are the easiest people milked when it comes time for a political election. So each time it's about to expire, millions of dollars come into our campaign finance system from these people who don't want to lose this benefit. And even the one time when it was allowed to expire, Congress came back, the next Congress, and retroactively revived it after all the money had been paid necessary to get them to do it. So, I think that in this kind of economy, in this kind of system, it's going to be very hard for the parties to resist the old game, given they realize they have a war to fight, and the war is going to require now $1 billion in the presidential election to wage. And so that's the reason to be pessimistic about any possibility for change here.
Let's do one or at most two more. We'll need to cut it off after that. Ma'am?
Question about copyright. So in this possible updating of the copyright system, where is the protection of traditional cultural expressions?
So that's a really hard question because the standard view of copyright is there ought to be such a thing as a public domain, which means that after a period of time, the work that's that old passes in the public domain and allows anybody to build upon it. And many of the people who claim support for traditional copyright, traditional works of expression want to, in some sense, remove that work from the public domain and go back and extend protection to it in a way that allows the value of that to be exploited. I'm not in favor of that. I think we have to protect traditional work the way we always protect traditional work, which means to give current generation the freedom to update it and make it salient and meaningful for that. And I think, this is a little bit of sacrilege to sort of connect these in this way, but let me commit the sacrilege. You think about Disney, Walt Disney, not Disney Incorporated, and where his greatest work came from. His greatest work came from taking a bunch of 19th century stories, which were in their original form completely incomprehensible to the 20th century audience he was talking to, and update them and make them salient and meaningful and have some play for the 20th century. So all of a sudden, these works that you would never read to your children, the Brothers Grimm, my God, they are really grim and really horrible stories. They have nice moral tales when they're updated in a particular way for Disney. Now, Disney gets to make tons of money on that. I agree. That's, you might say, oh, poor Brothers Grimm, poor estate of Brothers Grimm. And to add insult to injury, Disney is now guaranteed that nobody can do to Disney what Disney did to the Brothers Grimm, because copyright's now forever, and you can't do anything to modify it without getting Disney's permission. But if we had the traditional system, then people would be able to update Disney, and people would be able to update each generation's culture. And I think that's a critical part of what a free society has got to be. And the consequence of that might be that current tribes in Native American context don't have the capacity to exploit the value of their original work, and that would be one more negative in a long line of negatives against Native Americans in the United States, and nobody should minimize the amount of harm that's been done there. But I think it's essential in a free society that we can take our past and do something with it without getting permission from somebody.
All right, we're going to call it there. This has been really wonderful, a great way to spend time together, and I'm enormously grateful to Professor Lessig for giving us the time. Let's please give him a hand. Thank you all very much for coming.